Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jack Baker. I'm a faculty member here at Stanford, and I'm just going to make a few introductory remarks before our speaker comes up to the stage. Um, First, I'll make a few words about this event that we're at today. So this is the Shaw Family Distinguished Lecture. This is a special event we've been running for, I think, almost 20 years now. That's thanks in part to a generous donation from the Shaw family. So with that, I'd like to say a few words about our speaker this year. So Veronica is the president and CEO of GeoHazards International. That's a position she's held for 6 years now. Prior to that, she was at the Applied Technology Council as a director of projects. Previous to that, she spent some time at GeoHazards International and as well as a practicing structural engineer. She did her undergraduate degree at MIT in civil engineering, and then came to Stanford to do her master's degree here a number of years ago. And before moving on to her professional career. Her professional career is also, I'll note, we're not the only ones to try to honor her and recognize her achievements. She's a recipient of the Earthquake Engineering Institute Shaw Prize, recognizing early career practitioners working in risk analysis, as well as an EERI Hausner Fellow. This is a really interesting program helping to kind of groom future leaders and train them to have impact in the world. Maybe I'll note on a personal note, I remember very well meeting Veronica for the first time. It was in 2006. I'll go ahead and say the year. And I remember because that was my first year and my first month even as a faculty member here. So I came back to Stanford and was very early in my career, had some imposter syndrome. And I remember meeting Veronica. I was like, oh, geez, there's this MIT engineer here in the room. She's a really good communicator, really knows her stuff in a lot of different directions. And I had kind of some early insecurity, not because of anything in Veronica's personality. She was actually really lovely, and we got to know each other pretty well, pretty quickly. But I kind of watched even as a student. She was really, technically excellent, got involved in Engineers for a Sustainable World, and went off and spent a summer in Indonesia working on some risk reduction projects for dealing with tsunami risk that Padang was facing. And so already there was kind of the threads of kind of technical training combined with kind of action on the ground in the community to try to reduce risks. And her career has really blossomed over the years since then. And she's had tremendous impact and really been a great communicator and ambassador on this topic. So I think in recognition of her leadership, thought leadership and her activities and the role that she plays in kind of exemplifying for engineering students, how engineering training can be impactful in these problems, we were really thrilled to identify her as this year's Shaw speaker and invite her here this afternoon to speak. So with that, Veronica, it's a pleasure to invite you up to share your thoughts with us this afternoon.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. That's really meant a lot. So I want to start off by expressing my deep gratitude to Horace Shaw and to his family for shining light and encouraging people in this field that has become increasingly urgent. Their generosity makes this lecture possible, and it's also given me the opportunity to reflect back on what I have learned in my personal experience, as well as what I have learned from my colleagues and friends over the years. I also want to thank Professor Baker, Professor Dearline for their support over the years and for the kind invitation to give this year's lecture. It's a true honor for me to be standing before you today, and I feel deeply humbled to follow in the line of extraordinary speakers that have spoken in years prior. Disaster risk is complex and it is inherently technical, but it is also fundamentally human. Ultimately, disaster resilience is about saving lives and protecting what matters. If you take one thing away today, it should be this: progress takes people, it takes time, and it takes systems thinking. The world needs strong collective action from all of us in order to make meaningful progress. I hope that by sharing my thoughts today, it sparks new ideas and encouragement to take on this increasingly complex challenge ahead of us. Today, my talk will focus on practical strategies and lessons that I have learned over the course of my career. With that in mind, I wanted to start by sharing the story of how I got to where I am today. For many years, I was interested in figuring out how I can use my skills and knowledge that I was gaining to address and help with critical issues that were affecting people across the globe. but I wasn't quite sure how to do it. And I kept on running into dead ends. It was until I came here to Stanford that I first learned about earthquake risk mitigation. And it was here that I learned about a summer internship opportunity to work with a nonprofit in India to explore why certain buildings survived the historical earthquake. So without thinking twice, I turned down an opportunity to work at a structural engineering firm in New York City, and I headed off to an unknown world. That summer was one of the most difficult and life-changing times of my life. In those few months, I grew tremendously from a personal and professional level. I came back convinced that I knew what I wanted to focus my career on, but it was different from what I had initially anticipated. See, originally I had imagined that I would just gain a lot of technical skills and just apply them in at-risk communities. But that summer taught me that it's much more complex than that. During the course of those months, our team spent a lot of time observing and discussing the new concrete construction that was blowing up in the region and how it was so dangerous, particularly considering the practices and that we were in a highly seismic region. The columns were not big enough. There was not enough steel reinforcement. It wasn't placed properly. There was additional stories being added on top of existing structures that clearly didn't have the capacity to take these additional loads. There were a lot of issues. Towards the end of the summer, our driver, who had been listening to all of our conversations, mentioned something casually about building a house. And I said, well, I assume that you will build it out of the lighter frame, safer construction. And he said, no, of course not, Veronica. I'm building my house out of concrete. And I said, well, haven't you been listening to our conversations about how the practices being applied for the concrete are quite dangerous? We're in a high seismic zone, and a lot of these structures with these practices are quite vulnerable to collapse. He said, yeah, I've been listening. I'm aware. He said, for Veronica, I want a good wife. And I was shocked. And then I realized and I reflected on my time there, and of course, having a concrete house was more socially prestigious. And it was then and there that I realized that the one that had a lot of learning to do was me. That if I really wanted to have impact on the ground, I couldn't just stay in my silo thinking only on a technical solution, that I was going to have to think broader and see the bigger picture of what are all the different aspects of making decisions and how can we really make change on the ground. That experience that summer took my life in a trajectory I couldn't have anticipated. And actually, it was there in the foothills of the Himalayas that I first learned about the work of GeoHazards International. And to my surprise, I learned that their office was right across the street from where I was getting my master's degree. So when I came back to Stanford, I walked across the street. I introduced myself to GHI and finished my master's here. And I was lucky enough to be able to start working there after the fact. So with that, I want to tell you a little bit more about GeoHazards International, particularly because a lot of the case examples that I'll be covering today are either work that I have led while at GHI or that my colleagues, some of them in the room, have led. So, I'm not seeing this work. Give me a sec. Okay, it's just delayed. Okay, GeoHazards International, GHI, we are a global nonprofit founded in 1991 with headquarters here in California. And our mission emphasizes saving lives. And by saving lives, that means that we're working in some of the most vulnerable places in the world. We work by empowering at-risk communities to build resilience. This means that our approach focuses on equipping local leaders, local professionals with the skills and knowledge they need to take efforts forward in their own community. And we work ahead of disasters and climate impacts. So we don't typically do post-disaster work. The idea is that we're trying to identify places in the world that have a high disaster fatality risk and working there in advance to protect people and communities. We've worked in close to 30 low to middle income countries around the world and currently have people and efforts in Haiti, Dominican Republic, and India, Nepal, Bhutan. And just about a year and a half ago, we started a program in the Philippines. We're a relatively small organization with annual revenue of about $1.8 million. And we have about 20 people across the globe. But we bring on external partners and experts for any one initiative. So some of our projects can have upward of 35 people. we work on earthquakes, landslides, tsunamis, as well as climate-related hazards. So just to get us all on the same page, how is disaster risk increasing? We know that it's a factor of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. On the hazard end, with more frequent climate extremes, we're seeing hazard increase. So that whether it's wildfires, drought, extreme rain, flooding, typhoons. On the exposure side, we know that there's very rapid urbanization happening at many places around the world, and oftentimes this is happening in areas that have high hazards. So there's more people or infrastructure exposed to hazards. And then the building practices and that we're seeing in terms of how they don't many times consider the local hazards. So all three of these, the vulnerability, the growing exposure, and the increase in climate extremes combine are meaning that we're seeing this increase in disaster risk. So why are mitigation and preparedness particularly important where the places where we work? We're typically working in emerging countries. And the reason that's so important when we're talking about saving lives is because close to 90% of all disaster fatalities occur in emerging countries. And to give you an example of how mitigation preparedness can make a tremendous difference, I want to just share this comparison of these two events. So this is the 2010 Haiti earthquake, magnitude 7.0, and the 2010 Chile earthquake, magnitude 8.8. In the case of Haiti, we see that about 11% of those who experienced strong earthquake shaking perished. So that's about 220,000 people. And in the case of Chile, we had about 0.1% of those who experienced strong earthquake shaking died, which about 500 people. Chile had experienced a devastating earthquake back in 1960 that really sparked a lot of action. They did a lot around their building code, putting a lot of practices that considered the local hazards. And you can see that this clearly saved a lot of lives. But it's not just about immediate impacts. We also know that in low-income communities, with disasters, communities can lose everything that they own. This means that they have no redundancy, so they have to make very difficult life choices if they're left with nothing. Oftentimes, this means having to take children out of school. And so they no longer go back to school. You have these generational impacts, or people are thrown back into poverty. So the impacts from disasters can be much longer term, much more consequential for people in these communities. And of course, we know that mitigation and prevention is the most effective from saving lives and preventing these long-term negative effects. But we also know that it's most cost-effective. But unfortunately, when we look at the resources going to preventative measures, we see that the vast majority goes to reactive measures like emergency response, recovery, and reconstruction. And don't get me wrong, that is incredibly important. But I think if we ever hope to see a different outcome from future disasters, we need to start making sure that we're investing more in mitigation and preparedness. And so this is what this talk is going to focus on strategies that I have learned through my experience or from my colleagues of how do we try to spark that action in advance? How do we work on that 4.1%? So I'm going to take you through three themes around the question of how do we catalyze pre-disaster action? The first will focus on developing solutions that last. Then we'll look at strengthening local capacities. And last, leveraging opportunities and global knowledge. So the first strategy is about designing for sustained efforts. This really became clear to me when I was actually doing more work in the US. I realized that efforts in California to reduce earthquake risk actually started 100 years ago with the 1925 Santa Barbara earthquake. And it sparked a lot of efforts around this. And there's actually an excellent book that I was recently reading through. It's When Good Science Won. And in parentheses, I don't know if you can see it says, but it wasn't easy. And that's the whole point. I realized, the work in California is still ongoing. We still have work to do on reducing earthquake risk here. And California has some of the best financial and technical resources to tackle this issue. So what makes us think that we can go to another community or another place and build resilience with one project or one initiative? So this made me realize that as we think about these projects, it's really important for us to make sure that we're thinking of designing our efforts in such a way that efforts continue into the future. And for this reason, we think about disaster resilience as an ongoing journey. And those main steps, if you will, the first is about understanding the risk. What are the key challenges in this particular place, in this particular community? And working with local professionals and local leaders, then co-developing solutions. And that engagement with local leaders and local experts is really important because they're the ones that can really identify what's feasible locally, what is locally appropriate. We also do a lot of work around sharing knowledge. And this is important in pre-disaster work because people are often not even aware of the risks that they're facing or actions they can take to reduce their risks long-term. And throughout this entire path, we focus and emphasize strengthening local capacities, whether it's on understanding the risk, developing solutions, or communicating the risk to help spark action. And this is all really important because ultimately what we want to do is inspire locally led action. So I want to give you a specific example, a case study of what this roadmap looks on the ground. So I'm going to take you to a far northeast India in the city of Aizawl. So you'll see this short clip taking us there. So as you can see, it's on the other side of India, and it's actually pretty densely populated, even though it's quite isolated from the rest of the country. And this city sits on several ridges, as you see here, very, very steep terrain. It's a city of about 400,000 people. And so what this city is facing is has a steep terrain and then also just a geologic setting, has the bedding such that it's parallel to the slope, and the rock itself is quite weak, so it's very prone to sliding. And when this very rapid urbanization, what's happening is that these slopes that are already prone to sliding are being destabilized. And this is even more concerning when you look at the overall city and consider that this area sits in a very high seismic zone. So you could imagine with earthquake shaking, the number of landslides that could be triggered in this area. So what did the team at GHI do? First, it was around understanding the risk, particular to this location. So there was a earthquake and landslide scenario that was developed in conjunction with local and national professionals, as well as our international experts. And then the team worked directly with, Okay, so there's a delay. To co-develop solutions. How do we address this extreme landslide risk? So one of the first things that was done was developing a landslide hazard map that was detailed enough to inform development. Then co-developing an action plan that outlined immediate, medium, and long-term actions that specific agencies or groups needed to take to help reduce risk over time. And then our technical team helped advise a landslide policy committee that really took these efforts forward. On the sharing knowledge side, there's a lot of different ways and mechanisms that we've done this. It has included trainings, workshops, and raising awareness. And this has been for particular sectors, for example. And then on strengthening the local capacities, there's been technical trainings throughout, including for engineers, but also for geologists, the geology field school and training where they could understand how their expertise relates to the landslide hazard risk and how that can be implemented into policy to help reduce the risk overall. And now from the inspiring locally led action side, so all this work has happened over the past 13 years or so. And so there has been a lot of really exciting progress that has been led by Aizawl itself, and we have been kind of on or supporting from the side, if you will. And this has included the landslide policy committee putting forth new site development and slope modification regulations that were put in place in 2017. And this included requirements for geologists to inspect new developments and sites to make sure that excavation practices are being done in a way that considered the local hazard. There's also no build zones now and construction ban during the monsoon season. And for the first time in India, they've hired municipal level geologists to help enforce the regulations. And they also have about 100 geologists that have been impaneled to help with the volume of work, just given how much development there is. And so what we've seen is that since 2017, there's been a reduction in landslides. We're actually in the midst of working to quantify that reduction. And here you see one of the geologists and some of the Aizawl leaders being featured on local TV for their work. And Aizawl has really become a model city for other cities in India that face similar challenges. So ultimately, I think as we took this long-term approach has really facilitated them taking that forward themselves and continuing this work into the future. The next item I want to talk about under developing solutions that last is the importance of fostering collaboration across fields. We know that disaster risk is a complex social technical problem. It requires multiple perspectives, input, and buy-in. So for this reason, as we think about our teams, we're always thinking about making sure that they reflect diverse disciplines and that we're thinking from a systems perspective. So as we think also about bringing in representatives from key stakeholder groups, we're engaging them through committees or advisory groups or working groups. And one of the things that's really important is to engage them from the beginning. So we're not just bringing them at the end to give a reaction to what's already been completed, but they're an integral part of us thinking through the barriers that might not make any one intervention effective. And so it's really important to make sure that these different perspectives are all there so that we don't miss any one of these perspectives that could affect the effectiveness of the intervention. So to me, that was really clear actually from the story I mentioned earlier when I was in India. And of course, we know that sound science and engineering are absolutely fundamental. We definitely need that. That's non-negotiable, if you will. But in real life, we know that decisions are not made just based on a technical basis. As with my driver, right, who was thinking about making a decision around how he was going to construct his house, not just from disaster risk perspective. So the last item here is about integrating solutions across time spans. So we know that oftentimes risk can be incredibly overwhelming. It can lead to people feeling powerless or feeling like it's inevitable. So it's important to frame risk reduction as a long-term effort and to provide examples of how other places have made slow but steady progress. And it's not just important to share successes, but also failures so that communities don't make the same, don't go through the same process. They can learn from them and leap that, if you will. So for this reason, I talked a little bit about that and with the action planning, but we make sure to co-develop practical strategies that address risk in the short, medium, and long term. So I want to give an example of kind of this perspective with some of our work in Western Nepal. Western Nepal is quite far from kind of the center in Kathmandu in the capital. That's more in in central Nepal. And Western Nepal is quite remote, but it's rapidly developing. And we've been working here since 2016. And one of the key issues in this part of the world is the overwhelming and vast number of vulnerable school buildings. So here you see a picture of a typical stone masonry building in Nepal. Excuse me. And you see a school that's buried under rubble during the recent, pretty modern event of magnitude 5.7 event. So you can see that this type of construction is quite vulnerable to collapse. So what we've been doing is taking a multifaceted approach to address this issue with so many school buildings to look at. The first thing that we've been doing is promoting safer new construction. So one of the things we know in Nepal is that their model buildings designs for new schools are actually pretty good. And they have earthquake resistant features. One of the key challenges, though, in this remote area of Nepal is that although the designs are good, the masons or the builders on the ground do not necessarily know how to apply them. So what you end up having is buildings that are still vulnerable, even though you have good designs. So we've been emphasizing a lot around promoting safer new construction on just conducting training on earthquake resistant techniques. The second item here is to identify and strengthen existing school buildings. So we've done work around training local engineers to identify vulnerable school buildings and to assess the schools within their municipality. And on our wishes is to do a demonstration school retrofit, considering the local construction typologies. But if we only focus on these two, at the rate that schools are getting addressed, it's going to take about 200 years before all schools are being safer, or a large earthquake that would affect a lot of school children. So for this reason, we've been looking at interim solution. And the interim solution we've been looking at is earthquake deaths. And so I'll just point out a couple of key design features in terms of how this vest is intended to protect school children from falling debris during earthquake shaking. So in the center, you see this green center beam, and that center beam is intended to absorb and kind of absorb energy. So it's kind of like a crumple zone from a car. Similarly, there's these corner fuses that absorb energy either by piercing into the legs below or bend to absorb the energy. You can also see the yellow frame below that is intended to capture the plywood as it fails onto it and promote, have a triangular shape to promote debris slide off. There's also legs with rubber feet to help prevent too much sliding during earthquake shaking. So just to show you some of the progress that we've been making recently on this, this is an image of the laboratory tests that we conducted in Nepal. These, what you see here, are Nepal manufactured earthquake desks. And the smaller ones are elementary sized, and the larger ones are for high school students. And then you see the stone masonry construction here. This is, again, the typical type of school construction we see out in the remote areas. And then we have a heavy slate roof. This is actually the worst case. It's not the most typical, but we wanted to see what happened when we collapse this kind of worst case onto the earthquake desk. You might also know that there's water jugs. Those are simulating school children under the desk. And then we also, for the first time, tested these side panels to help protect school children from lateral falling debris. So with this, I want to show you a quick video. So this is a shock table. So what you'll see is that this pendulum that is here will pull back and hit the shock table and basically collapse the structure onto the desk. And in addition to these shock table tests, we also conducted some compression tests to better understand. So this is a 2-point concentric test, and then we had a 2-point eccentric test, as well as a uniform test. And the idea is here is to try to understand the full capacity of the desk. And so what were the results? We saw from the shock table test that the desk did phenomenal. They basically only had some aesthetic damage, and that was kind of expected from what we saw from the compression test, when we saw that they can absorb a lot more energy than could be expected from the collapse of this one-story stone masonry structure. We also noted that the side protection, so we put side protection only in some of the desks, and we said that that made a big difference in terms of protecting children underneath. So this is something that we would move forward with putting forth in the design. Because this was back May of last year, and so since then in December we went to conduct drop demonstration for key stakeholders. And just to show you some short clips of that, this is the drop demonstration in Western Nepal. Here's a Kathmandu for national stakeholders. And here's a regular desk. We only did this with the national stakeholders. And that was at 350 kg at 3 meters for the regular desk and 700 kg for the earthquake desk. And here's our national representative. Here is our local engineer who is describing the design without the plywood top. He's describing the design to local stakeholders. So overall, with this multifaceted approach, what we're doing is recognizing and promoting the really important work that you need for long-term earthquake resilience, which is constructing safer buildings, identifying existing vulnerable buildings and strengthening them, but also recognizing that there's school children in these schools that need to be protected now or soon in the future, because there's going to be decades and decades and decades before these schools are made safer. So the next theme is about strengthening local capacities, and I'll start with the importance of empowering local champions. So also some of the work that I actually learned here from my colleagues is how important local champions and local ownership, how key they are to progress. And oftentimes the local champions can look very different. They can be technical, but they don't always have to be technical. We can partner as technical groups with advocates to help move efforts forward. And one of the kind of the interesting groups that kind of popped in my head was thinking about all the work that, for example, this group of Oregon parents organized together to help address their vulnerable school buildings, and were very effective at pushing and advocating for change. Similarly, we saw there was a group of parents that did the same thing in British Columbia. And so that's got me thinking that actually, when I think about our staff, a lot of them on the ground are really like local champions, that there's so much value in equipping them and having them be stronger champions for resilience in their own communities. And this is so important. And to give you a particular example, I talked at length about the work in iZone, how that's been really successful overall. But a key ingredient to that was Rimpu Ibla, who's a person on the ground, who's been the one to make sure that the efforts continue long term, that as we're thinking about these regulations, they are still being supported with changes of government, for example. And here she talks about the huge struggle to make this happen, and says how it takes investing time, it takes patience, it takes building relationships and not giving up. Here's another example. This one's from a post-earthquake situation. So this is a photo of our staff member, Jeff Thitt, who's been working for us in his hometown of Ansevo since 2016. And for many years, he was on the radio talking to the community about earthquake risk reduction and the importance of being prepared in tsunamis. And then comes 2021, there's an earthquake. And so everybody gravitated to him. They knew him. They trusted him. So he was very well positioned to be able to be there for his community as a trusted resource as we were getting information about aftershocks, for example, from USGS, we were able to make sure that he had the latest information. He was the one out in his community, sharing this information and more broadly. And he also was able to identify key gaps where we could provide value. So in this case, it was one of the kind of rare cases where we did do post-disaster work because we were so well placed to support the community. So this is really how I see our staff on the ground. These are the people who are in their communities, and I see them as our local champions. They're our full-time staff, but they're absolutely key in making sure that efforts are sustained beyond any one project or initiative. And one thing that I want to point out, that was another lesson I learned from our work actually in Peru, is what is local? So in the case of this project, we were doing some work in a rural Andean village, and we had partners with the Technical University in Lima, as well as a nonprofit in Lima. And it was really interesting to me. The whole time I was like, okay, we have local partners. But because I speak Spanish, I was able to observe the dynamic, and I realized that for the people coming from Lima, for the people on the ground, they might as well have been foreigners. It was not local for them, and it's so obvious once you think about it. We were going to do work in the South, for example. We wouldn't take someone from New York City to lead the work and say they're local. But this really stayed with me. It made me realize, and as we think about the work that we're doing in Western Nepal, for example, not just having someone from Nepal, but having someone from that area is incredibly powerful and can make a big difference. So second here is about harnessing local strengths. I think in our world, we often talk about vulnerabilities. We focus on what can fail, what is weak. But I think there's a lot we can do around identifying local strengths, networks, and opportunities that can be tapped into. One of these things is just genuine engagement of local leaders and experts. They're absolutely key. They can bring in a lot of insights. They have trust. They have influence in their own communities. And an overall question I like to ask myself when I'm working in any one community is looking around and saying, okay, what's already here that can be leveraged? And this is particularly important in settings and low-income settings where resourcefulness is absolutely key. And by the way, this is actually a strength of a lot of people in these communities. They're used to having to be resourceful. So their insights and how they can tap into these different strengths and networks can be incredibly valuable. So just to give you a couple of examples of how this local knowledge can really help us identify opportunities. So here is a quote from our field engineer in Western Nepal. And one of the things that we made sure to do as we were doing our technical training for local construction workers here was to engage women. And he stressed how important this was. Here he says, women we train here, it's women we train stay here for a long time. And training women will not only benefit them, but also the community. Let me explain. So in this part of Nepal, it's very common for men to leave the region to work elsewhere and send money back home. And by providing a technical training, sometimes we inadvertently incentivize that because with a new certification or a new training, they're better able to get a job elsewhere. So by trying to help a community, we actually have those skills leave. But women tend to stay behind. So making sure that we're including women, make sure that we can have these skills stay in the community long term. We can also make use of the built-in natural environment. So looking around and seeing what's already there that can be leveraged. So a simple example is conserving mangroves for coastal hazard risk reduction. We could also look, for example, when we're looking at a hospital complex and thinking about moving critical functions to a building that is the least vulnerable so that we can increase our chances for the hospital to be able to function after a disaster. We can also, when looking at tsunamis or floods, we can improve access to naturally occurring high ground for evacuation. Or also for tsunamis, we can evaluate existing structures for potential evacuation. Another thing that we do to help spread messages is engaging youth. We often talk about youth as being very vulnerable, but they can also be incredibly powerful advocates if they're equipped and informed. We know that youth can be very influential amongst their peers and their family. And so one of the things that we do is try to make sure that what we teach them, we do so in a creative way and so that they can share with the broader community. And by doing it in a creative way, it just ensures that it's something that they will remember for a very long time. And this is important because ultimately, as we're thinking of disaster risk and resilience as a long-term effort, we need to think about how they are the future of their community. At some point, they will be the ones making decisions about how to build their house or maybe future leaders in any one location. So just to share some of the ways that we engage youth creatively, here you see a photo of some of the youth that they're featuring, the mural that they helped design on, and that included tsunami safety messaging. We also have competitions and contests of them sharing what they learned through poetry or through theater. And then the top right, you see a photo of actually this is a youth group that was sparked from one of our projects on mangroves. And this is a youth group that was formed that they call themselves the Mangrove Warriors. And they themselves decided to do this social media campaign with selfies and photos in these mangroves and raising awareness around their peers about why mangroves are so important for risk reduction. Also, how we think about working with different groups. We always think about who on the ground is influential, who's trusted. And this can really differ depending on the context. So to give you two very different examples. So for the work that we conduct in Bhutan, we know that the central government is incredibly effective at implementing changes in their planning and their policy. So we're always making sure that we're working with the central government. In the case of Haiti, there's a lot more government instability. So a lot of the work we do can look quite different. And we tend to focus more on grassroots level. And so we might be working or send messages through churches or through schools. We also bring in other perspectives through local organizations by partnering with them. Oftentimes, they can bring in strategies or insights that help us better understand people's barriers and concerns. And this helps us develop ways of working that are maybe more effective. So to give a particular example, this is from our work in Peru, and we were focusing on technical training on strengthening adobe structures. But our local partner, one of the key things that they recommended was to make it, to bring in a more holistic approach and also talk about housing rights and the importance of land titles. And by talking about these aspects where it's really important for risk reduction, because by not having an official land title, means that families cannot access national level resources to strengthen their homes, to repair their homes, or reconstruct their homes after a disaster. So either pre or post. And so by bringing in this aspect and not just making it about one particular topic, we were able to get interest from a broader portion of the population. The last thing on strengthening local capacities is about focusing on process, not just product. So to give an example here, this is the cover of a multi-year, this is a report documenting some of the findings from a multi-year project that my colleague led. And this was looking at how past geologic hazard scenarios have been effective at leading to mitigation or to action. And this was a global study looking at doing a global literature around the world, but also doing a lot of interviews in key locations to understand where were the key ingredients, if you will, that made some scenarios so effective. And a major finding was that the participatory processes are more likely to succeed at fostering an understanding of the risks, the buy-in for the recommendation, and a feasible path to action. So this participatory action is so important. And to give you an example of what this can look like on the ground, here are some photos of our assessments and mapping of mangroves that we conducted in the Philippines. And this is the community going out and gathering data on the mangroves. And this data was then fed into the model for our technical team to try to get an understanding of the protective value of the mangroves. And when the community saw what the model showed from data that they had gathered, there was this sense of pride and ownership that I think is so important in terms of thinking about, efforts continuing. Our technical team could have very easily gone out and gathered this data maybe in a more efficient manner, but by including the local community, it made a big difference in terms of that ownership. And as part of that work, this is one of the activities, but this is actually a part of the group that is, and I know this is too much to read, but just to give you a sense of, this is them pledging, saying that they understand the importance of their local mangroves and how this can help protect them and their families, and that how they are committed to making sure that they are protected. So last, I want to talk about leveraging opportunity and global knowledge. So the first item is around fostering global knowledge exchange. So I've talked at length about local, how that's so important. And we know, of course, that every place in the world has its unique context, but barriers and challenges can be similar. And so this creates a great opportunity for us to share approaches to solutions. And so I want to share with you a case study where this really came to the forefront for me. And this was for our work on tsunami evacuation in Padang in West Sumatra, Indonesia. This is a long-ago project that initiated back in 2008, and it was in collaboration with Stanford, with Tohoku University in Japan, Andalas University in Indonesia, and our local partner, Bogami. So the issue we were looking at was tsunami evacuation in the city of Padang. And the question was, how do you evacuate hundreds of thousands of people within 25 minutes? This is the time frame that people had to get to safety between the earthquake shaking and the tsunami wave arriving at the shore. And as you can see, it's a very densely populated city, most very close to the coast. And we knew this was a huge issue during that time. Actually, there was 2 earthquakes that occurred. Thankfully, they didn't generate a tsunami, but there was a scare. And you could see the immense gridlock, if you will, and panic that occurred following these events. And so we knew that had a tsunami occurred, hundreds of thousands of people could have perished. And in addition to this, we had an issue with seeing that a lot of the construction was inadequate if people wanted to go into existing buildings to evacuate from the tsunami. So we asked ourselves the question, other countries face similar problems. What strategies had they used to overcome them? So interestingly enough, at that time, actually here in the US, there was a lot of work around tsunami vertical evacuation structures. And this is because there's a major tsunami risk in the Pacific Northwest from the Cascadia subduction zone. So running all of Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. And there's many towns like Seaside, Oregon here, where there's thousands of people, and they only have about 20 minutes to evacuate and get to safety. And this was the motivation behind these FEMA guidelines that were developed by the Applied Technology Council on designing structures for vertical evacuation from tsunamis. And this was a guidelines that where we learned a lot about how is the U.S. tackling this issue? What examples have they put from other countries? And so, just to give you some sense of kind of all the different options we were looking at for vertical evacuation or from helping to reduce the risk of tsunami was these kind of towers, if you will, seawalls, also artificial hills, looking at existing buildings or new buildings. And so we came up with four options for vertical evacuation that we thought could work for Padang. And the first was looking at new building design, just given the latest guidelines on how to design these. The other was on existing buildings for tsunami evacuation. For this one in particular was interesting. We focused on trying to understand if existing mosques could be strengthened or adapted so that they can also serve for vertical evacuation. One of the things that we saw from the Banda Aceh, the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami in Banda Aceh, in that area, that several of the mosques actually survived quite well, as you can see here. And because they had a lot of inherent features that from the guidelines and as we were thinking about what are the things that you want in your design, it included things like redundancy of columns, and you want to have a large area for evacuation for people to gather. So there was a lot of things that just mapped to mosques. So this is something that we looked at. We also developed a new concept for tsunami evacuation first. It's just an elevated park. And in addition, this is actually the last example here, the tsunami that came from that same thought of like looking around and saying, what's already here that can be leveraged? So one of the things we noticed was that there was a lot of pedestrian overpasses in Indonesia. They're very common. That's how you just get across a very busy street. So we started thinking, well, maybe we can make these into tsunami decks and people can evacuate here as a last minute resort if they need somewhere to evacuate to. And this was an idea that we developed with our Japanese colleagues and something they were really interested in. And it just so happened that at the time, as we were developing this idea, the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami occurred. And what was really fascinating, so our colleagues up at Tohoku University were actually affected by this. And so one of my colleagues afterwards sent me a photo saying, Veronica, you're not going to believe this, that there was actually a pedestrian overpass that was not designed for tsunami evacuation, but people used it. So here you can see the wave coming, and people basically last minute ran out of their cars and went up to this pedestrian overpass, and it saved people's lives. And this photo at the top is actually after the fact. This is after I visited months later. But it was really interesting to see that actually work in a way that we can have thought. But in addition to this, actually, this is after the tsunami, but in Japan, there's actually, I think this is in Shizuoka, Japan, there was actually a national tsunami deck constructed. And as far as Indonesia and Padang, they've been doing a lot of work since those efforts. So that's included building, constructing 4 vertical evacuation structures that house thousands of people. They've also built additional bridges, improving access to naturally occurring high ground. Their new emergency operations center is now outside the inundation area. And they've also been promoting a lot more development outside the inundation area. So as we think to the future, I think about all those lessons I've learned, and I think about places we're working now. So for example, we have here Cap Haitian Haiti that faces a similar problem. How do you evacuate hundreds of thousands of people within 10 to 25 minutes? The case of Cap Haitian, we have 275,000 people facing a tsunami risk with about 10 to 15 minutes to evacuate. So part of the work we're doing is trying to understand how can we use those lessons to help support the work in this community. And for this reason, we emphasize a lot of sharing in our work. Here you see one example, the tsunami sharing webinar that we put on, and this was sharing across Haiti, Dominican Republic, and the Philippines. And we had a panel of reactors from Puerto Rico, from India, and really it's sharing these lessons. And we do that across South Asia as well. Here's another example, and then across the globe. So the second item here is about leveraging post-disaster attention. So a colleague of mine once asked me, Veronica, you work in pre-disaster, like, how are you ever going to get people to care? They build in very risky ways like this all the time. They have other pressing needs, other things to worry about. Like, how are you going to get them to care about this far off risk? And upon reflecting on that, I realized that there's actually a lot of the times that we've been very effective at working with communities has been leveraging post-disaster attention in areas that haven't been affected. So let me walk you through this. So here is an aerial photo of Banda Aceh in Sumatra before the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. And here's a photo of it after the fact. Banda Aceh was the worst hit city everywhere that was affected by the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. They lost more than half of their population. But if we look down the coast, so you see Banda Aceh at the northern part of Sumatra here. But if you just look down the coast, we have this other city, Padang, that was not affected. And that's the city I was just mentioning on the tsunami vertical evacuation work. But because that happened so close by, people cared. They saw the effects in Banda Aceh and said, oh, wait, hold on. Do we have a similar risk? And they realized that they did. And this created a window of opportunity where there was interest, even though there's all these other issues to work around. They realized the importance of this. We have a similar situation in Haiti. This is the island of Hispaniola that spans both Haiti and Dominican Republic. And here you have the major earthquake faults. And the earthquake that occurred in 2010 was near the capital, Port-au-Prince. And Haiti being so centralized, many people, even if they were not there, knew someone who was affected or felt a very direct impact, even though they weren't there necessarily. So that kind of opened up a window again for us to work in all these other places, including the Dominican Republic, where people actually cared about these topics. And so that was that opportunity to talk and to progress. So lessons learned, we know that these large disasters can create windows of opportunities for other nearby at-risk areas where we can work on pre-disaster. We also know that windows of opportunities often don't last long, so it's valuable to act fast or to be ready in advance, to already be working. And to give you an example of how that can progress ongoing work, another key part of our work in ISOL that helped to progress things was that there was actually a landslide in the middle of the team developing the scenario and action plan. And this deadly landslide helped to focus attention and accelerated progress. So my last point is on turning moderate events as catalysts for action. And I put this as a separate thing because there's a different level of attention when you have a huge disaster versus a moderate event. And with moderate events, they can be really valuable. They can uncover vulnerabilities that might be obvious from a technical perspective, but it might not be obvious to decision makers, for example. Or it could also uncover unexpected damage or challenges. They basically serve as a warning for subsequent larger events. But oftentimes we hear that there's limited resources, this is not a large event, so we don't pay enough attention to them. But I think there's a lot of opportunity to leverage this to create, to catalyze an action. So to give you some particular examples, here is a map of the major historic earthquakes along the Himalayan region. And the larger the oval, the larger the earthquake. The darker the oval, the more recent the earthquake. So here you see the earthquake from 2015, the most recent one. But you might also notice that there's very light shading in Western Nepal. And that's because they have not had a large earthquake in over 500 years. And so this is actually where we've been focusing our work on that I presented on the earthquake desk and this promoting safer school construction. This is the area that's rapidly developing, and we're trying to make sure that there's safer construction practices. But recently, there's been 2 moderate events in this region, both of magnitude 5.7. And this has really served as a wake-up call. We know this area is capable of producing earthquakes over magnitude 8. And even with these small earthquakes, we saw significant impacts, 155 deaths, 81 of them children, 400 schools destroyed, around 30,000 houses completely destroyed. And this disproportionate level of damage given the magnitude of earthquakes demonstrated this dire need to address vulnerable buildings. So we're trying to leverage this time where people are realizing the need for this and basically trying to promote pre-disaster for the large earthquake action. Another example is in Bhutan. Here are 2 moderate earthquakes that affected the country. This is in the 2009 Monger magnitude 6.1 earthquake, and then 2011 Sikkim 6.9 earthquake that also caused damage in Bhutan. And both of these were really instrumental. Here's our local engineer who's been our national coordinator since 2019, talking about how the 2009 earthquake was the turning point for disaster management in Bhutan. And that was followed by the 2011 earthquake, which accelerated the progress. So by the time they got to 2013, Bhutan had its first ever disaster management act. It also had its first ever school drill across the country that is now held on an annual basis. And GHI also helps support with developing national action plans for earthquake risk reduction for hospitals and schools. And the government is incredibly active. Since then, they've been doing so much around earthquake risk reduction. So we continue to support them as they move forward. So bottom line, modern earthquakes present an opportunity to spark action before a larger event strikes. But it's really important that on the flip side, we make sure that it's flagged as a moderate event and not the event, because it could actually hurt us. If people are thinking, oh, this is the event, my house wasn't damaged, I'm fine, then actually that can hurt us in terms of taking action. So I think there's a lot of work that we can do around thinking about how do we communicate with communities after these moderate events so that they realize that this is a warning signal, not a test that we are resilient enough. So before I wrap up, I want to hit on one more thing, and that is the challenge of our time. I talked about disaster risk increasing, but I want to talk a little bit about the increasing complexity of disaster risk. So the first thing is that we know with the next item is around interaction with existing hazards. So to give you specific examples, with more extreme rainfall events, area that already has landslide risk, it just brings these slopes much closer to failure. So it just increases this existing hazard. Similarly, with sea level rise, as we look at particularly at very flat areas, we expect tsunami inundation to go much further inland. So as we're planning for evacuation routes and thinking where are safe locations, they may no longer be safe locations decades down the line. And with these extremes happening more frequently, there's just a higher likelihood of concurrent events. And this doesn't mean that they have to happen exactly at the same time. When we look at a disaster, there's a whole window of the disaster cycle would be where there's the event itself, but there's this whole recovery period. And that can be months, it can be years. And so for another event to occur within that window is much more likely. And one of the things that we know from concurrent events is that they can also amplify impacts. And let me explain to you what I mean by that. This is an example from the Mount Pinatubo 1991 eruption that happened close in time with a strong typhoon. Had the eruption just happened without the typhoon, most of the volcanic ash would have probably flown offshore. But as interacted with the rainfall, it created very heavy wet ash that fell onto the community, onto infrastructure, and caused damage and impacts that wouldn't have otherwise been possible. So key takeaways. We know this is a very urgent problem. We see this staggering increase in disaster risk and climate extremes. But we also have to recognize that now disaster resilience by nature, it's long-term and it's quite complex. It's important for us to keep sight of the importance of process and the importance of being a catalyst because we want efforts to continue into the future. Resilience is local. We talked about that at length. Champions and strength on the ground are absolutely key, but also knowledge is global. There's a lot of opportunity for us to share with one another to help build that local resilience. And last, leveraging windows of opportunity. We see that with large disasters, so we can catalyze pre-disaster action in nearby areas, but also doing more around leveraging moderate events. So around key recommendations and needs, I think with this new kind of level of uncertainty, as we can no longer look back. And when we think about, how do we design our structures, what level of loads do we need to be thinking about? Perhaps we need a new paradigm of thinking because we don't know which path we will take when it comes to climate. So it's very difficult for us to make decisions now that people in the future can inherit those decisions. So do we need to be thinking about different scenarios as we design, or do we need to think about adaptive design? So we think about, think about this structure failing and how do we design in such a way that we could repair or reconstruct in a quicker way? And on that same point, I think the integration of nature-based solutions is so important, particularly because they actually also have this adaptive nature to them. So, for example, mangroves can adapt as the water table rises or sea level rises. Planning, policy, and infrastructure design for concurrent events, as these become more common, getting out of the practice of thinking of planning for these in silos, but thinking about their interactions. And last, I think as I've been thinking more and more about the increasing complexity of disaster risk, it made me wonder whether we should be considering professionalizing what I've seen labeled as are called boundary spanners. And these are the people that bring together the various disciplines needed to take on this very complex risk issues. And so as this becomes more complex, should we be thinking about people who have a more formal training and understanding enough of these disciplines, but you still meeting these subject matter experts, but enough of these disciplines, but can bring them together so we can have a common language and move things forward. So to end, I want to leave you with one last thought. All the work I talked about today, although impact the progress has been made possible thanks to countless individuals, many of who you see here. Um, these people from all walks of life had either contributed or dedicated their lives to a shared vision, and that's building and creating a world that's more resilient to disasters. And that's the key: sustained collective action and systems thinking towards a common goal. The work is far from done, and I think it's going to take all of us with our different talents, experiences, and perspectives to make progress. So I leave you with this. What role will you play in taking on this urgent need? Thank you very much.